Welcome to the debate. Today we are directing our focus toward the complex, multifaceted schism between Iran and numerous Middle Eastern, predominantly Arab nations. Our discourse today is rooted in the geopolitical analysis presented in the source material Divided Sands: The Geopolitics of the Iranian-Arab Schism.
Right. It's a really fascinating text.
It really is. And we are going to be looking at the primary driver of this regional fracture. We're asking, is this fundamentally a classic geopolitical struggle for external security and regional dominance? Or is it, primarily an ideological conflict driven by the imperative of domestic political survival? I will argue that the schism is fundamentally a geopolitical balance of power conflict, driven by external security threats, military escalation, and economic competition.
And I will argue that the divide is primarily rooted in internal regime survival, where status quo states must distance themselves from Iran's revolutionary ideology to manage domestic stability and identity politics.
So let's just jump right into the structural realities outlined in the material. When we examine the decades-long power struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran, we are really looking at the foundational anchor of all regional dynamics here. The text makes a compelling case that this is a material clash. It's about influence, power, and security. And we can actually see this playing out on the ground in their militaries and alliances. Consider the formation of the Saudi-led Gulf Cooperation Council.
The GCC, yeah.
Exactly, the GCC. This bloc of wealthy Arab states wasn't just, a social club. It was explicitly organized to counter Iranian influence and consolidate a defensive posture against a rising regional hegemon. We're seeing state-level competition where both Tehran and Riyadh are backing opposing sides to secure what analysts call strategic depth.
Right.
It's essentially building a physical buffer zone so that any future wars are fought on someone else's soil, far from their own borders. And the threat is incredibly physical. Look at the Iranian drone and missile strikes on the United Arab Emirates. That demonstrates that the danger is a kinetic military reality. Gulf states are aligning with Western security frameworks and purchasing advanced defense systems because of these very tangible external threats.
I hear you on the military hardware. I really do. But the true root of this friction is internal political survival. If we look back at the text, the real turning point wasn't a conventional military invasion. It was 1979.
The Iranian Revolution.
Right, because in its aftermath, Iran started actively exporting this Islamic resistance model. Suddenly, for Sunni-majority governments that are trying to keep things exactly as they are, nations like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, Egypt, Iran isn't just a military threat over the border. It's a revolutionary state capable of exporting an ideology that inspires internal unrest.
Well,
these Arab governments are deeply concerned with their own legitimacy. The strategy to keep Iran at a distance is largely a domestic calculation. It's designed to prevent the empowerment of internal opposition movements and to maintain absolute control over sectarian narratives within their own borders.
but you're heavily emphasizing this fear of ideology, and I have to ask how that explains the sheer scale of the proxy conflicts we see in places like Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. When we look at those battlegrounds, we are not looking at a battle of ideas. We are looking at standard, pragmatic, geopolitical maneuvering.
I would argue the exact opposite, actually. The very mechanism of those proxy wars is ideological at its core.
Let's look at the mechanics of it, though. It's a classic Cold War playbook. It is much cheaper for Tehran to fund a militia in Yemen than to build a conventional army to march across the desert. It's a low-cost, high-reward way to project power and keep their rivals constantly putting out fires. The objective in Yemen isn't to win a theological debate.
No, but
It is to secure a foothold on the Arabian Peninsula and pressure Saudi Arabia's southern border. In Syria, it is about maintaining a vital logistical corridor to the Mediterranean. It's about geography.
Yes, the geography matters, but look at how Iran is operating in those spaces. They aren't just sending checks to aligned governments. Iran's method of utilizing non-state militias changes the nature of the threat entirely. We are not talking about conventional armies meeting on a battlefield. We're talking about Iran bypassing traditional, recognized state borders to appeal directly to minority populations or disenfranchised groups within those sovereign nations.
Which is a highly effective asymmetrical military strategy.
It is, but it strikes at the very core legitimacy of neighboring governments. When Iran supports a non-state actor in Lebanon or Iraq, it is actively undermining the authority of the central government. The threat to these Arab states isn't just about losing control of a piece of territory in a buffer zone. It is about the erosion of the state itself from within. By promoting this Islamic resistance model, Tehran is signaling to populations across the Middle East that an alternative to Western-aligned, monarchical, or status quo governance actually exists.
I think calling it an ideological struggle overlooks the deeply pragmatic, territorial, and resource-driven nature of these proxy wars. The Gulf Arab states are pushing back defensively to protect their spheres of influence, not just their domestic image.
They push back because the leverage Iran seeks is achieved through ideological infiltration that fundamentally destabilizes the internal cohesion of its rivals. If your population starts looking to a foreign capital for leadership, your state is already failing. That is why these Arab states react so vehemently.
Okay, let's shift from the proxy battlegrounds to direct state-on-state military escalation, because this is where the internal cohesion argument really starts to strain for me. The physical security dilemmas completely overshadow the domestic messaging. Let's return to the material facts outlined in Divided Sands. Iranian missile and drone programs are highly advanced, and they have been used to strike directly at Gulf states. You mentioned earlier that the threat isn't just a military reality over the border, but for the UAE, it quite literally was.
No one is denying the missiles exist or that they do damage, but we have to look at the reaction to them.
Well, the reaction was a massive diplomatic pullback and a rapid acceleration of defense procurement. The UAE strongly condemned these strikes because their physical infrastructure and economic hubs were explicitly targeted. Saudi Arabia offered immediate support, labeling it naked aggression. Actions like a drone striking an oil facility or an airport make cooperation with Iran politically and strategically impossible on a state-to-state level. Ideologies don't blow up refineries. Missiles do.
Missiles blow up refineries, yes. But how does the state explain that explosion to its citizens the next morning?
They call it an attack.
Yes, but the military threat is undeniably real, while the rhetoric surrounding these military actions is meticulously calibrated for domestic control and identity politics. Let's examine the domestic utility of the Sunni-Shia divide, as the source material presents it. We both agree that theology isn't the absolute primary cause of the conflict. However, governments actively use the fear of Iranian influence, particularly the fear of Iran influencing Shia minorities within their borders, to solidify national unity.
You're saying they leverage a real physical attack to bolster their domestic standing.
I'm saying it's a classic strategy of pointing to a menacing external other to demand domestic obedience. When tensions rise in the Strait of Hormuz, or when a strike occurs, the state media apparatus in these countries immediately frames it through a sectarian and existential lens. This ensures that their populations rally behind the government. Aligning openly with Iran, or even pursuing détente, is viewed as politically costly because it would unravel the very narrative these governments rely on to justify their tight control over society.
But that narrative relies entirely on the reality of the physical threat. Look at the economic competition, the rivalry over energy markets, the control over vital shipping routes, the persistent tensions in the Strait of Hormuz. These are the lifelines of the global economy. Over 20% of the world's oil passes through that strait. The friction there is about controlling physical resources and securing borders against kinetic attacks.
And what is the primary tool they use to secure those borders?
Strict reliance on Western alliances. They coordinate closely with the United States and European powers to purchase sophisticated defense systems.
Exactly. The Western weapons they buy certainly provide physical defense, but the alliance with the West itself serves as a bulwark against the revolutionary model Iran represents. The hardware is military, but the motivation is deeply tied to preserving internal regime survival. If they don't have absolute security, they look weak, and looking weak invites the very internal opposition they fear.
Let's test that theory by looking at the behavior of states that do not fit neatly into this paradigm. Divided Sands highlights glaring exceptions to the rule, specifically countries like Qatar and Oman. If the divide were truly about a revolutionary ideology, fundamentally threatening all status quo states in the region, we would see uniform hostility across the board. But we don't.
They are fascinating case studies. I agree.
They operate as vital mediators in the region. They maintain balanced, functional, and sometimes even cooperative relations with Tehran. Why? Because they have successfully mitigated the direct military and security threats. They have navigated the geopolitical landscape to ensure they are not caught in the crosshairs of the balance of power struggle.
I look at the exact same evidence regarding Qatar and Oman, but I draw a completely different conclusion on why they can do that.
Take Qatar, for example. The text points out that Qatar shares a massive natural gas field with Iran, the north field for Qatar, south Pars for Iran. That creates a profound economic incentive for cooperation. They essentially share the same plumbing. You can't afford to go to war with the country you share your primary source of wealth with. Oman, similarly, has a long history of independent, neutral foreign policy. Their behavior proves that when direct external security threats are managed, or when there is overwhelming economic incentive, the supposed ideological and religious divides can simply be ignored.
You're framing it as an economic decision that overrides ideology, but let's look at their internal demographics. Why are Qatar and Oman capable of sitting at the table with Iran without fear? It is precisely because their specific domestic political structures are not as vulnerable to Iran's revolutionary messaging.
Because they're wealthier,
Because their domestic stability is highly secure and their populations are relatively cohesive. Oman and Qatar do not face the same internal demographic pressures or fragile sectarian divides that countries like Saudi Arabia or Bahrain must manage. Their leadership legitimacy is not currently under pressure from the kind of internal opposition that Iran's ideology historically inflames. Therefore, they have the luxury of engaging with Tehran diplomatically.
so you're saying their lack of internal friction allows for external diplomacy.
Exactly. It reinforces the core premise. Where domestic stability is secure, relations with Iran are possible and pragmatism can flourish. But where domestic stability is fragile, or where the state relies on a strict sectarian narrative to maintain power, Iran is immediately treated as an existential threat. The exceptions of Oman and Qatar don't disprove the domestic survival theory. They validate it by showing what happens when the fear of internal unrest is removed from the equation.
Even if we accept that Oman and Qatar possess greater internal cohesion, their actions are still fundamentally shaped by external strategic calculations. Let's look at why they mediate. They don't mediate just to be friendly neighbors. They mediate because it elevates their diplomatic standing on the global stage. It makes them indispensable to Western powers who need back-channel access to Tehran. Their domestic stability simply affords them the bandwidth to play a highly sophisticated geopolitical game.
It's certainly a sophisticated game, but the foundation of that game is self-preservation.
But when we zoom out and look at the broader region, the dominant narrative remains one of intense structural rivalry. The text is very clear that Middle Eastern states distance themselves from Iran due to long-standing historical divides that have morphed into an intense geopolitical competition led by Saudi Arabia. This competition is characterized by severe military confrontations, strategic alliances with Western powers, and a relentless focus on economic supremacy. Geopolitics and strategic interests trump ideology.
And while I concede that the geopolitical maneuvering is intricate and constant, I maintain that it is entirely subservient to the imperative of regime survival. They are just trying to stay in power. The alliances, the proxy wars, the military expenditures, all of these are tools utilized by status quo governance structures to insulate themselves from the revolutionary shockwaves that originated in 1979. The divide is fundamentally about internal stability and the clash between a revolutionary, non-state empowering model and governments whose primary objective is the preservation of their own legitimacy and domestic order.
Well, as we draw this discussion to a close, it is clear we have reached some important points of convergence. We both acknowledge that the Sunni-Shia theological dispute, which often gets highlighted in superficial analyses of the region, is merely a layer over a much more complex strategic reality.
Absolutely. The sectarian divide is a tool, not the root cause. Whether we view this through the lens of external defense or internal preservation,
The actions taken by these state actors are heavily calculated, deeply rational efforts to maximize their power and ensure their survival in a highly volatile region.
And combining these lenses, understanding both the external military strategy and the deep internal political vulnerabilities, provides a much richer, more sophisticated understanding of Middle Eastern geopolitics than either perspective could offer alone.
It forces us to look beyond the headlines of a missile strike or a protest and examine the underlying machinery of statecraft.
The material we've explored today in Divided Sands contains even more layers, particularly regarding regional reconstruction and the use of economic leverage, which we highly encourage listeners to delve into further. The intricacies of this region demand rigorous, continuous analysis. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.